Got him!
Originally, I was not going to make that joke, but with writing like this...
I'm serious. I mean, the itchy asshole symptoms you must be having must be crazy. And having a clean ass...
The game can handle some extra memory. Far Cry 4 is the fourth major release in the Far Cry opus, a series that featured mutated monkeys in 2004, ditched them in 2008, and brought them back with tremendous acclaim in 2012, except that this time around, the mutated monkeys were on the opposite end of the counter. And for my educated viewers, yes, I know it's not mutated but evolved, and it's not monkeys but apes, and it's not really apes but an ape-like creature. But back on topic, released 2 years after the aforementioned peak, Far Cry 4 tried to emulate the success of its predecessor by emulating just about everything else, and the outcome is a product that proves several hypotheses of game design, namely that open-world flying is underrated, actual side quests really do matter, and shaping the fate of a nation is far more engaging than an edgy kid doing drugs and becoming insane. I think it is somewhat evident how I see Far Cry 4 in reference to its predecessor, Far Cry 3. Despite the two being very similar, I would not call Far Cry 4 a copycat release, but a rather more polished and better perfected version of a flawed predecessor. Think lore versus data, or if that reference is too obscure, then Jericho Hill versus All About Soul. Alright, maybe this will suffice.
I know every routine you ever did. I did them first. And I did them right.
In fact, Far Cry 4 is likely the most well-rounded game Ubisoft have made in their distinct style. It is the peak of Ubisoft's take on the open-world formula, the period after they had learned that malaria really shouldn't be a gameplay mechanic, and slightly before they ascended into the cliché levels that only Infinity Ward was thought could achieve. It was the perfect middle, and it was for the most part put to good use. An exotic open world teeming with side quests and collectibles, a story-driven main quest, and several functioning approaches to gameplay. A number of flaws, mainly resulting either directly or indirectly from the open world formula, and an overall successful product. If you're watching this expecting to learn whether or not Far Cry 4 is worth your time, you will find the answer as I presented strong elite points. And if you have played the game and want to hear another person's opinion of it, and you happen to consider me a person, although that is ill-advised, then it is a critique. So without further ado, let's go right into Far Cry 4, and as the meta implies, let's start with the graphics. Despite looking pretty good, Far Cry 4 is visibly dated. The problem is not that it is visually incompetent, but rather that AAA titles tend to age badly when their only strength is how real to life they look, for the simple reason that better technology allows subsequent releases to make their flagship predecessors look dated in comparison. And Far Cry 4 is affected by this phenomenon, and definitely looked good in 2014, but it does not compare to later titles. With that said though, it still has some visual fidelity that makes it pretty good, even after a 4-year generation gap. And we cannot ignore the fact that, compared to its contemporaries, Far Cry 4 is beyond a doubt one of the best looking titles the scene had to offer. 5 years past its release, it is for the most part the textbook definition of okay, with two qualitative exception categories that, to put eloquently, fall into contrast between the occasional and a hefty sum of. To elaborate, for the most part, you will be looking at visuals that are almost bipolar in their effect. On the one hand, you are offered vast landscapes and a pretty impressive draw distance, but given that you will probably not be playing with anti-aliasing, most of the draw distance will be too jagged to look as good as it should. Then you might marvel at the lighting during the day, only to wonder how come that after having seen 6 in-game sunrises and sunsets, you're yet to see night. And then you realize that the dusk-like sky in between sunset and sunrise was actually the night sky, and karate vegetation is apparently fluorescent. You will definitely enjoy the outdoors, but indoors are pretty bland, and whereas most of the game is pretty immersive, you will no doubt notice flashing lootable bodies and flashing weapons, even the non-lootable ones. I would say that for the most part, the game is visually marred by the imposing of those aspects of game design that have to do with the technical or the part of being a game, more so than the part of being a visual art, with the former seriously imposing on the latter. This extends to the point of the part. Take this for example. I descend down a stony cliff, which presents me with a prolonged display of low-res textures, a potential visual glitch, and last but not least, people mourning their dead. Which doesn't seem that bad until...
Namaste, Ajay.
That woman went from lamentation to a howdy in a split second. Repetitive scenery, visual glitches, and NPC incongruencies are a huge downside to what can otherwise be a very immersive experience. On the other hand, Far Cry 4 can and does look incredible at times, even in 2019. It is at its best with its outdoor ambient during any time of day that is not night. The lighting and the foliage and the way they interact with each other can make you, either consciously or unconsciously, spend a hefty time just walking around and enjoying the landscape. And any action game that can get you sightseeing is a good looking game. The ambient around sunset is actually kind of reminiscent of Stalker, and that is a great upside. And every once in a while you do notice certain bits of evidence that the developers did actually care to achieve something more than technical fidelity. Another one of the game's strengths are its explosions and depictions of fire, which spreads quickly and burns things in real time, much like you would expect in a Far Cry release. And finally, one of the best implemented visual effects, and the most unique one at that, is the change of climate. Not weather effects, mind you, but climate. Although geographically impossible in such a small place, the climate in the game changes the farther north you go. Down south it is thick with vegetation and all kinds of greenery, but as you progress up the map, you will notice a seamless change from the warm, lush and exotic to the cold, not so lush yet still congruently exotic. Eventually, you make your way to the snow-capped Himalayas, which, though not part of the open world, complete the continuum of climate across the map. However, being a Ubisoft title that is not Far Cry 5, it has serious performance issues. On a 7th generation i5 and a 6GB GTX 1060, playing at full HD maxed out, with the exception of anti-aliasing, I struggled to maintain 60 FPS during battles. In fact, frame rate would drop down to 45 during bigger encounters. While the majority of the time, that is while exploring and sneaking, I had a mostly smooth 60, stuttering followed through a lot of the action-packed bits. It messes with your aim, it interferes with immersion, and it seriously hinders the potential flow of bigger action scenes. And bear in mind that the 1060 is more or less matched with the 980, which was the contemporary high-end card. So it is fair to say that Far Cry 4 is very unoptimized if you're looking to play at high settings. And by that I mean maxed out. If you simply want to play at high settings, then a 1050 Ti should suffice. And provided you do not care about detail at all, then a 750 Ti should be well enough. So it isn't absolutely or unplayably unoptimized, which is a good thing. Although I never could have predicted myself saying this, Far Cry 4 does not only have the best story in the series, but it is also a great example of what gaming can achieve as a medium for storytelling. It follows the established format of a dude lost in a foreign land meeting a villain who is a Joker-esque stone-cold eccentric killer in possession of a small or not so small army that you're tasked with bringing down. This time around, the action takes place in Karat, an Asian country that is a cross between Tibet and rural India. So rural, in fact, that their toilets are not even paved. This entails less focus on the tropical and a lot more emphasis on the mystical, which definitely reflects in the story.
Want the knife? Please.
So much so that there is an expansion called Valley of the Yetis, and it is exactly what it sounds like. And while the main storyline certainly doesn't take on the sci-fi elements of the original, which is unfortunate, it does go back to the spiritual original of the series, which is Far Cry 2. It is much darker than its predecessor, to the extent that this one is actually dark, and its main theme is ambiguous, twisty, and can actually be depressing. I don't want to give anything away, so we'll leave it at that. The story is a surprisingly strong side of Far Cry 4. However,
having a clean asshole when you're defeating evil is very important.
It is not consistently well written. It is definitely better written than Far Cry 3, but not by much. Whereas on the one hand it poses themes such as a civil war, a mad leader, and the quandary of oppressive tradition versus moral degradation, it also tries to mingle them with comedic relief, resulting in the flippant imposing on the serious, with the flipping being cringy and the serious being lost in all the cringe. Luckily though, this does not interfere with the holistic experience. During main missions, where you need to be serious, you get to be serious, but during side quests, well, it is as if they're not even canon to the story, so opposing elements kind of even out. There is also a change in storytelling mechanics in that the player is allowed to make decisions during main missions, decisions which affect gameplay and story alike. Some of them are overt and others are more subtle, and some will take you a while to notice. These offer not only alternate endings but also two sets of main missions, and that is a neat mechanic taken over from Far Cry 2. Moreover, psychedelic elements are reserved to side quests as a separate story, meaning that you can skip them if they happen to bore you, although I will mention that this time around they do offer a solid experience, in presentation, gameplay, and narrative alike, so the story is an overall positive score. And so we're getting gameplay side. Well then, Ubisoft. In case you don't know, you're thrown in an open world crowded with human enemies, a bunch of outposts for the taking, and animals that can survive headshots from a 357 Magnum. You're given a simple, if not poor, loot, craft, and upgrade system, and a ton of side quests and collectibles, a matching arsenal of firearms, as well as other just as lethal takedown alternatives, and you get to walk, swim, drive, glide, and fly your way across the game world. But where does Far Cry 4 differ from the typical Ubisoft or the typical modern open-world shooter? One is maneuverability. This time around you get the wingsuit early game, meaning you can quickly and easily traverse downslope areas, as long as you don't finish face first, which is trickier than it sounds. You also get a grappling hook to climb designated cliffs and caves, which adds more verticality and freedom to the level design than previous or competing titles. Even though the pseudo-platforming can get annoying after a while, I would rather it exist than not be implemented in the first place. While most vehicles may be the standard issue four-wheelers that control like old-up bricks with an occasional and not very useful machine gun attachment, there is one vehicular addition that makes up for the otherwise bland collection, and that is the buzzer. This helicopter-looking thing, which officially does away with any obstacles presented to traveling in a straight line. It is the ideal problem solver for traversing large areas of the map. There is also the quick travel system, and last but not least, the tropical equivalent of tanks, elephants. Not only can you ride them, but you can ride them into battle. And no, I don't have footage of it, don't ask me why. Or do, I don't know, I'm yet to receive a comment on these videos. So in regards to traversing terrain, until they make either a good Superman game or canonize no-clipping, Far Cry 4 will be an open-world title that can boast of making travel as convenient for the player as possible. That is, within the borders that the setting of the game world allows. And whoever made the M79 a sidearm may be the most brilliant contributor to the game. This one-handed grenade launcher can destroy vehicles in 1 or 2 shots, has decent splash damage, reloads in a whim, and can hold up to 50 explosive shells. It is easily one of the best weapons in the game. And speaking of weapons, the arsenal is as abundant as you would expect, with a bunch of regular guns as well as a few signature items which you unlock by reaching a certain criteria. The best of these is the MG42, which is not only cool in that it is an MG42, but it is also ridiculously overpowered. Just look at it. In fact, it is so OP that Redditors call it a fact. Yeah, stealth takedowns, abundant in potential and about as difficult to pull off as the portent to a distant child. The stealth system has you tagging enemies, planning out a route or not, breaking line of sight, silently disposing of said enemies, hiding the bodies or not, breaking alarm systems or not, and eventually emerging as Ubisoft's own ninja trainee. Chain kills and all the different types of takedowns also find larger use, even in open world encounters. Alternatively, you can unlock the game's easy mode by stealth sniping your way to victory. And provided you don't mind the very artificial pinpoint hit scan system of the sniper rifle, it is actually a genuinely fun, old-schoolish approach. And regarding items, in addition to the standard issue stat amplifiers and explosives, you can also use meat to attract predators to a position of your choosing. The inventory system has also been somewhat tweaked. Changes are too minute to mention here, but I will just say that it is an improvement over Far Cry 3, even though the philosophy of hoard everything then sell everything is just as prevalent. Now let's talk about the open world itself, or what you can do in it. You will be spending most of your time clearing outposts unless you're a completionist, in which case you will be spending most of your time exploring every nook and cranny the game has to offer. And keep in mind, this is a Ubisoft title, but that's your problem. And clearing outposts may well be the main selling point of the game. They're abundant, unique in layout, and you can tackle them however you please. In the meantime, you will probably engage in the numerous time killers and filler content the game has to offer. First, there's the grind aspect, the type that has you ignoring the main storyline for the purpose of making yourself as rich, leveled up, and best equipped for the challenges to come, which after so much grind will not feel like challenges at all. So I advise you go easy on the prepping. Then there are semi-side quests, which are really just outposts or shooting galleries with certain objectives stacked on to make them interesting. They do not have stories, meaning that they're not conventional side quests, but if you like the game's mechanics, you will like these as well. They're the perfect kind of optional filler content. There are also events, which I will deem quarter side quests, that appear at certain points of the game world, seemingly at random, and they have you performing miniature heroic actions, such as helping out allies in need, or assassinating an enemy courier who happens to be nearby. Finally, there are all of the random things that make the open world an unpredictable place and ultimately add to the fun/frustration, depending on how lucky or unlucky you get. You fight an enemy patrol, blow up their vehicles, try to save a hostage. Wonder how in the world you missed that shot. Twice. Have the hostage run over by a truck in the meantime, try to destroy the truck, get it to stop, blow it up, and get run over by a civilian. Then respawn, kill a vehicle in a single shot, kill a rhinoceros with 3, make short work of Pagan's trained army, skin the rhino for money, one-shot an enemy heavy, and empty an M4 extended clip in a black bear's face. There is also a unique aspect to the random system in that the player can stop enemy activity in a region by taking over the designated fortress, which is a larger, almost level-sized version of the outposts. Progressing through the story weakens them, although it is more fun to tackle them while they're operating at full capacity. So all of this, in addition to the main story and side quests, probably sounds like quite the time-demanding ordeal, and I'll say that it is. On average, and depending on how you play, Far Cry 4 appears to be between 17 to 45 hours long, which is probably nothing for the average epic gamer, but it is fairly long regardless, seeing as the average single-player game takes less than half that time. And this begs the question of whether it becomes repetitive. And the answer is, it depends. There are two types of people who will get to skip the repetitive aspect. Those with busy lives who can only put in about an hour of gameplay per session, at which point the repetitiveness eludes them, and those with enough leisurely idle time not to mind the repetitiveness. Of course, being busy and completely idle at the same time are not necessarily mutually exclusive things. In my world, we call such a state finals week. But if you play continually or you don't put a lot of time between sessions, Far Cry 4 does become repetitive. And this is where your enjoyment of the game becomes a skill on its own. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. We usually think of skill as one's ability to win, but in reality the broader definition is about one's overall mastery of the mechanics. And part of that mastery is related to whether or not you can utilize them to make the game more fun, that is, how much you can utilize of what it has to offer. And the trick in Far Cry 4 is variety. If you get bored of grinding, go and do some missions. When they start to feel repetitive, go and do some main quests to advance the story. When main quests become too restrictive, hit the open world again. And when it starts feeling goalless, that's nihilism. The same goes for approach. If sneaking gets boring, get an LMG and a rocket launcher. If action starts to feel lame, try doing some takedowns. Far Cry does not require that you excel in anyone's skill, but rather that you are okay at most of them. And part of the reason for that is that it too is mediocre as well, if you concentrate on isolated mechanics. And that makes a full circle with the sense of repetition, as the more time you spend in each makes this more noticeable. Consider the story missions. For the most part they are fun, but they're not fun enough to make you want to play through the game twice. The forced stealth sequences are down to trial and error, and the forced action sequences are just Call of Duty-esque shooting galleries. And speaking of COD-esque mechanics, the shooting mechanics are exactly that, cover shooters with hit-scanning enemies. I've already mentioned that enemy variety comes in the form of unbelievably tanky animals, so get ready for a pretty bland roster of things to kill. The gunplay is also deceptive in its facade of abundance. To elaborate, you get 3 weapon slots for primary weapons and 1 slot for secondary. Your secondary slot will be occupied by the M79, which is impossible to refuse. This in turn makes all other sidearms obsolete, seeing as they're just inferior versions of their primary counterparts. Of your primary weapons, the first slot will be the bow. It is silent, one-shot kill, and a makeshift rocket launcher. It has become an iconic weapon for the series. Next, you will probably want a sniper rifle because open world also means long range. Thus, we have just 1 slot left. Well, let's see what we have at our disposal. Submachine guns are just assault rifles with crippled range and damage output. Concerning shotguns, in a game where people die from 1 or 2 shots anyway, the extra damage is not worth the sacrifice of range and rate of fire. And explosive weapons are already covered by the bow in your secondary, so that leaves assault rifles and light machine guns. If you can tolerate the movement speed debuff, you would go for an LMG. Otherwise, your last slot is all but guaranteed to be an assault rifle. You get 6 of these, but 4 of them are tier-based, so in reality you get to choose between 3, the P416, the M14, and the Galil, which are generic automatic, precision semi-auto, and full damage, in that order. And so the abundant weapon selection suddenly narrows down to a choice of 4. Although there is a unique and so-called signature arsenal, the weapons it offers are either too overpowered to be fun or too situational to be useful. The flamethrower, for example, while cool, is largely inefficient. It is short range, it obscures vision, blocks your path, and there's a delay between the time you fire and the flames hit your target, making it just a chaotic and inefficient one-time use gimmick. And for a guerrilla-themed game, the AK-47 sees little to no use. The only way to experience the game's full arsenal is to try and deliberately cripple yourself by choosing an inferior loadout. And given that most weapons are simply head-scanning guns you've used countless times in other games, there's little reason to do that. I've commended the stealth for being solid, but it lacks the big levels, gadgets, and light and dark mechanics of an actual stealth game. Moving around can also be frustrating when the residue of a cardboard box botches your jump several times in a row. Level up mechanics are just a matter of objectively useful perks, and if you play them right, the game should become a cakewalk about a quarter way through. The game economy is just a hoard and sell principle. And as intriguing as the endgame may be, it takes a while to get there, through a series of blank characters, shallow premises, and a largely absent antagonist. With that said though, is Far Cry 4 a mediocre title? The answer is no. In reality, while its individual categories are merely decent, it has so many categories that fit so well that the full game is more than the sum of its parts. The issues I mentioned are just the flaws that prevent it from being an amazing title or joining the greats. It is a great game in the general sense of the word, competently made and entertaining, but it will probably not be remembered in the same way as the first Far Cry or Crysis, which were excellently made and memorable alongside entertaining. Much like Jet Li is a great big screen martial artist, but he is not in the same league as Jackie Chan. Would I recommend it over Sniper Ghost Warrior or Homefront The Revolution? In a heartbeat. Would I recommend it over Far Cry 5? Probably, since I do not even plan on playing Far Cry 5. but I would not recommend it over Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. However, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, I definitely think you should play this over Far Cry 3, or even GTA 5, or 4. Far Cry 4 is the best open-world FPS Ubisoft have made so far, and it is beyond a doubt the best of the main Far Cry series, excluding the first. It may not be perfectly optimized, but it looks well enough to be worth the visual experience. The story may seem all over the place at first, but it works exceptionally well when it gets things right, which is unfortunately in the last quarter. And the gameplay packs a solid 17 to 45 hours of entertainment. It takes the good elements from both its predecessors and improves them. The grim ambient, decisions, and blank protagonist of Far Cry 2 mixed with the visual expression and abundant open world of the third. And if you decide to play it, make sure to get the expansion The Valley of the Yetis, which has you surviving in a snowy top on the Himalayas against cultists, predators, and the eponymous mythical beasts, which are actually foreboding and sufficiently challenging enemies. Visually impressive, about as entertaining as the original game, and containing an element of base building, which seems to be slowly becoming the benchmark of open-world games. I'm Crichton, and you have been watching my review of Far Cry 4, a good game that I recommend if you are looking for an open-world solo shooter. In regards to it being the best open-world title Ubisoft have made in their distinct style, I believe my hypothesis to be confirmed. I don't have other Ubisoft titles in mind anytime soon, but I just might make a Far Cry 3 video at some point because I do want to explain why I feel about it the way that I feel. And if you've played both and also have an opinion worth sharing, or if you have in mind another Ubisoft developed game that you believe should take Far Cry's place as the most representative title, go ahead and make your case in the comment section below. I would be happy to discuss it. In fact, it just might facilitate the creation of a Far Cry 3 video. In the meantime, stay tuned for either another video game review, or maybe a literature review, or, if I seriously invest, something much different. Until then, take care, and remember, that's nihilism. Peace out.